over here. What do we got audio-wise? Let me check. Actually registering anything. Spoken volume looks like it's pretty good. We'll gain it just a smidge. Turn up that gain. A little more sensitivity. There we go. All right. Well, I think the plan for today, we have a Fossil Day happening at the Headwaters Science Center here, so we are have some sort of fossil-y content out. We also have sort of our regular fossil-adjacent content that happens here at HSC, which is our monthly Prehistoric Painting Night, which is coming up on the 16th, this coming Sunday, whatever day that is. And as I often do for Prehistoric Painting Night, usually Carl asks me to paint an example miniature, one that he can use when he's showing the guests that actually come here for Prehistoric Painting Night. And he likes having me do it because I'm not somebody who paints miniatures, so I oftentimes don't do a very good job of it. And I usually do them for a live stream, so I'm often distracted and I'm sort of, you know, got to do it relatively quickly, so I make kind of a junky one. I tell people it's on purpose, but actually I'm just bad at it. But anyway, then he uses that as an example of one that, you know, showing people how theirs might end up looking at the end. I said, this month we're doing one that actually I requested, one of my favorite prehistoric animals. It's a species of what we call Placoderms, and Placoderms are really cool. They're this group of really, really old fishes. I mean, we're talking about 400 plus million years ago when these guys are a thing. And in particular, we're doing a species called the Dunkleosteus, which is probably the most famous of the Placoderms. It's very much sort of an apex predator of its time. Placoderms are kind of unique in that they're these fish, and they are bony fish. They have bones. They're actually kind of one of the first animals that have actual bones, the way we think of them. Some of the first animals that have teeth. But really, like, their big innovation specifically is jaws. They're really the first animals that have jaw bones, the way we sort of think of jaw bones is existing now. And so Dunkleosteus in particular is famous because of, you know, the Placoderms being kind of a thing in their era, but also Dunkleosteus was, I think, as far as we know, this was true at one point, but I'm not necessarily always current on my paleontology. As far as I know, the biggest Placoderm that we're aware of, with size estimates ranging a little bit, but somewhere in the range of like 25-ish feet long these things could get potentially. It's tough to measure them because the thing that they're sort of known for, like the thing that Placoderms have, is this big like sort of armor like helmet that they sort of have on their head. And so a lot of the times they'll just find these big helmets. When they find fossil remains, all they find is the head with the rest of the body not there anymore. And so there's not really good fossil evidence for how the back 2/3 of this animal looked. And so when you see depictions of them, usually it's a guess and assumption based on similar related fish that we do have better fossil evidence from. And so I said, I'm going to try and do a couple of them here. So this is actually, funnily enough, one that we tried to do last fall. It might have even been last October we were going to do them. But then we ended up canceling that Prehistoric Painting Night because there was another COVID outbreak. And so this one that I've got here was the one that we were initially going to do last year. Cut to, I said, a year later, and now this one is the one we're doing. So it's got this fun kind of hinge to it. And even open and close the jaw. Move the head and open and close the mouth. Again, signature trait of it, so of course you gotta have the jaw. And then I also have Angela here with me, who is one of our other newer education staff. In that way, there you go. Here's Angela. You may have noticed I didn't do one of these painting nights last month because I forgot. And so Angela is painting one of the ceratopsids. I don't remember what species this one is exactly that we did for painting night last month. And so relevant because, hey, maybe you're somebody who's come to a few of these prehistoric painting nights, but you weren't able to make it to one. Sometimes we do have extras, and I know the plan is that Carl has mentioned is that at some point he wants to do a painting night that's just sort of a makeup work one, where it's like, hey, you missed September 2022. That was the ceratopsid one. Come on in, whatever we have spares, ones that didn't get used during their night, you can grab one now and get your painting in and complete your collection. And so, as I said, I'm kind of doing the same thing, and, well, I'm making Angela do the same thing for me. That's what we're doing. But anyway, as I have been doing too, we're going to learn a little bit about these guys, because I'm you get into these deep paleontology stuff, and that's kind of beyond the scope of what I am like really super knowledgeable about. I said I like Dunkleosteus. It's one of my favorite sort of prehistoric critters, but I'm sure there's plenty of stuff out there about Placoderms that I don't know about. And so we're going to watch a couple videos here too. Again, PBS Eons coming out great. Big shout out to PBS Eons. They seemingly always have some sort of content and everything I'm looking to talk about here. So I'm just going to get this started, and then we're going to start painting. So we have a couple boxes of paint kind of tucked away behind here. It's kind of a weird setup because I'm also out here for Fossil Day. So we'll get this started, and I'll probably do a little volume balancing here once we get the video started, but then we're going to get right into painting.
420 million years ago, life was definitely better down where it was wetter. Dryland was still new and relatively empty, but in the seas, life had reached a fever pitch of diversity, especially among fish. The world's oceans teemed with sharks, primitive ray-finned fishes, hagfish, and even our very early ancestors, the lobe-finned fish. With such an abundance of life unfolding from 420 million years ago to 360 million years ago, it's no wonder that the Devonian period is often called the Age of Fish. But the fish that the Devonian is perhaps best known for were a little different than the ones you and I know today. Back then, some fish were more medieval. They wore armor, sometimes made of big plates and sometimes made of interlocking scales. And the evolution of armor may seem like an obvious adaptation for protection, especially in the Devonian's crowded seas. But that armor may have served a totally different purpose, one many animals still use today, including you and me. The earliest armored fish we have fossils of is called Saca Bambasmus, a member of the subclass known as Arandaspida. This fish lived in the coastal waters of what's now Bolivia during the Ordovician period, some 470 million years ago. And honestly, it looks more like a watermelon with a tail than a fish. It had no jaws and no dorsal or side fins. It was only marginally more fish-like than its earlier relatives, hagfish and conodonts, with which it shared a common ancestor. But what it lacked in fishiness in the front of its body, it made up for with an extravagant tail, complete with a shark-like fin and a long, scaled rod extending from the tip. And the most distinctive feature of this fish was, of course, its armor, a new adaptation probably made of a primitive bone-like tissue called aspidin, as well as dentine and enameloid, materials that are very similar to the ones that make up your teeth.
Yeah, one of the things on here is when we're going back far enough that we're actually talking about, like, what are bones? We're talking about the animals that are sort of innovating just bones existing generally. And it's interesting because you see stuff like dentine developing first, if I recall correctly, as you see like toothy kind of parts developing first before you actually see bones, which is interesting because like nowadays when I think of like if I'm trying to tell like if an animal is a vertebrate from the outside, if you go back and you watch my my Ryan's room on the Toronto Raptor, you'll hear about one of the things I talk about is how I was relatively confident that it was a like bony animal because it had teeth, and you need something for teeth to sit in, which generally translates to having a jawbone. And so it's interesting that they're talking about how dentine and enamel are sort of becoming things first, and that's actually true. In a lot of the ways that it formed first was as like seemingly formed as like armor. You have all these little fishes that have just these like hard parts on top of their head basically that are made of that rather than necessarily like bone.
Its armor covered the head in big plates with smaller joined chevrons running along the rest of its body. So Saca Bambasmus was the first fish that we know of to acquire this kind of covering, but it would soon have many imitators. The period that came next, the Silurian, saw the evolution of armor in many groups of fish all around the same time. One such group was the Heterostracans, whose name means different scales. They too looked like small armored ovals with thick fleshy tails. Polypolepis, for example, swam around Latvia 420 million years ago. It was only about 8 centimeters long, but its armor was especially beautiful, made of intricate, ridged, interlocking scales. Other Heterostracans had fused plates on their heads with diamond-shaped or elongated scales covering their tails. But head plates took on new forms in another group of jawless fish, the Osteostracans, whose name means bony shields. The armor on these fish was typically just a large one-piece shield that covered the head, made out of dentine and bone with smaller linear scales along the body. These head shields were...
And these guys are sort of the like marquee fish that exists before the Placoderms does. Like they're sort of the dominant species. Like when you think of like this time period, this is sort of the thing you think of as far as vertebrates go, I guess.
Were wider than the rest of the body, and they sometimes tended toward extravagance, as in the case of Boreasmus, a fish that sported a large spike sprouting from its face. Osteostracans also boasted a brand new
Not
feature,
sponsored.
namely dorsal and small paddle-like side fins that gave them greater mobility in the water. And this is where armored fish start to take an especially interesting turn, because osteostracans are among the few jawless fish to have a bony internal skeleton, or endoskeleton. They didn't have much of one. Their backbones, like those of heterostracans and earlier fish, were made of cartilage, but their fins and parts of their skulls were some of the first made of bone. And this brings us to probably the best known armored fish, the placoderms. Placoderm means plate skin, and plated they indeed were, with big chunks of bone, dentine, and an amyloid armor on their head and bodies. And some placoderms...
That in this fossil you're seeing on the screen right now is quite famous. It's one that has been much replicated, and you can find in museums all over the world. Closest one that we have here, I know the aquarium in Duluth has it. I know there's one in Toronto too. I don't think there's any down in the Twin Cities, but it's one where like you can walk into museums all over the world and see replicas of this specimen here.
The covering got up to 5 centimeters thick. But placoderms were also unique among armored fish in having a complete mineralized internal skeleton, meaning they had both an endoskeleton like you do, as well as an exoskeleton. And their endoskeleton and exoskeleton were completely separate. For example, the skull of a placoderm had an internal brain case made of endoskeletal bone. Then, as an additional layer, outside of that, unconnected, was a thick layer of exoskeletal bone. And one more thing that set placoderms apart from earlier fish was that they were the first fish to have jaws, giving them the ability to bite and chew and grind rather than just scrape or filter feed. Now, one of the most widespread placoderms was Bothrialepis, which was able to live in oceanic environments, estuaries, and freshwater settings. And while this fish had jaws, it didn't have true teeth. Instead, it had bony plates that used to grind up its food like decomposing plant and animal matter. Much bigger than Bothrialepis and more carnivorous was Dunkleosteus, a giant predator that could reach up to 9 meters in length with massive shearing jaws. It didn't have teeth either, but the sharpened sections of bone it used instead could have produced up to 7,400 newtons of force, making it one of the strongest bites of any fish living or extinct, and certainly the strongest bite in the world at the time. So armored fish came in a variety of shapes and sizes during the Silurian and Devonian, from tiny heterostracans to massive placoderms. But why did these fish evolve armor in the first place? I mean, it's possible that the armor evolved as armor to protect them from other fish and predators. And indeed, bite marks on armored bone and remnants of armored fish found in the feces of other animals are common in the fossil record. There are even fossils of Dunkleosteus that bear the bite marks of other Dunkleosteus. So if armor evolved for protection, it was not 100% effective. But that might not have been its only purpose. Instead, the evolution of bony armor might have had a whole lot to do with storing vital minerals. See, bone and other bony tissues contain a lot of calcium and phosphorus. You probably know that these minerals help keep your bones strong, but they're also necessary for a lot of chemical processes in your body, like muscle movement. That's right, calcium's not just for bones. You need a certain amount of calcium for your muscles to work because it makes your muscle fibers contract. And phosphorus is an important part of that little molecule your body uses to store and transfer energy, adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. So without phosphorus and calcium, the internal workings of your body, or that of an armored fish, basically just wouldn't run. That's why modern animals, including you, use bone as a repository for calcium and phosphorus. We have special cells that quickly break down bone, sending calcium and phosphorus into the bloodstream in a process called bone reabsorption. When bone tissue is broken down like this, it changes the microscopic structure of the bone, and scientists have seen signs of those changes in the armor of heterostracans, osteostracans, and placoderms. So it seems that these armored fish did use their bony armor for mineral storage, and this ability may have been one of the key reasons that these fish were so successful, allowing them to take over all kinds of watery habitats. Both calcium and phosphorus are present in water, but they occur in much lower concentrations in fresh water than they do in the ocean. And heterostracans, osteostracans, and placoderms have all been found in both salty and freshwater environments.
One of the other things I've heard on this is that the sort of hard parts broadly, I guess not necessarily like the bony head plate, is that it happens like in conjunction with gill plates being a thing, where the gill plates are what most fish have, and I think all bony fish have them to this day, where it's a mobile part that they can like open and close to push water past their gills. The benefit of which is that they don't need to be moving all the time to breathe. So like sharks, for example, can't stop swimming for an extended amount of time because they'll suffocate, because they don't have gill plates, they just have slits, so they have to like manually be moving to keep water moving past their gills. And so I've seen like the jaw and sort of broad sort of bony thing. I feel like I've seen models where like the facilitation of making gill plates is what has sort of the gill plate comes first and then sort of expands into sort of the armory thing. The other thing I was thinking you might talk about here, and I don't know if I've ever heard this anymore, but I was sort of expecting the direction for him to go, is that you need big hard jaws to eat big hard food, basically. And a lot of the stuff that's in the ocean right now are like, you know, kind of soft-bodied animals in shells. So the thing that at least I've always associated Dunkleosteus with eating is things like Ammonites, which are, you know, basically a little squid kind of thing inside of a, think of it as like a squid inside of a snail shell, basically. Which, or if you're a Pokemon fan, Ammonite and Amistar are Ammonites. So something like that, being able to have, you know, something big and hard and strong to crunch through those shells would have a benefit too.
So then, having big bony shields may have acted like a camel's hump for calcium, an important resource that kept the muscles working at top speed while they explored rivers and lakes. And of course, it's also possible that armor evolved for both reasons, as a convenient storage for muscle-moving minerals, and a nice piece of protection to help keep you from getting chomped on. So you can credit these ancient fish for acquiring the evolutionary breakthrough that was the mineralized suit of armor. But do we have them to thank for our bony skeletons? Probably not, or at least not directly. We might be able to trace them back to a common ancestor. The problem is that, like so many things in paleontology, the relationship of armored fish to other living things is vague. Most of today's bony fish are ray-finned fishes, and land-dwelling vertebrates are descended from lobe-finned fishes. It's not clear how armored fish, especially placoderms, were related to either of these groups. Some scientists think that while both ray-finned and lobe-finned fish share common ancestors with armored fish, they aren't their direct descendants. Others think that most placoderms specifically share common ancestors with ray-finned and lobe-finned fishes, but there are some placoderms that are more closely related to lobe-finned fishes than to other armored fish.
Yeah, because you get sort of two separate groupings with fishes, where you're seeing this like ray-fin versus lobe-fin thing, but you also get the bony versus cartilaginous and your jawed versus unjawed. So I guess there's three sort of separate groups here. So the earliest separation you get is the jawed versus jawless fishes. And so again, with this, you're talking 450 million years ago probably where that separation happens. And so these guys would obviously fit into the jawed fishes, and this is where they would diverge from things like lampreys, for example. But then you also get into the cartilaginous versus bony fishes, which again, these guys would be a part of the bony, well, here is the question, is are they a member of like any of the current sort of bony fish groups, or do they represent a separate bony fish group that died off? Are they bony fish at all, or are they a completely separate, just like dead lineage that doesn't really belong in that group? But you see, they do have bones. Like, I guess I lean towards calling them bony fishes because they have bones. But this is where you would separate them from something like a shark, for example, that has a fully cartilaginous skeleton, rather than something like a bass that has a bony skeleton. These guys would share a common ancestor more recently with the bass than they would with the shark. And then you get into, within bony fishes, you have these two separate groups that currently exist, which are the ray-fin fishes, so things like bass, the lobe-fin fishes, which used to be very common. Again, you go back couple 100 million years, 300 million years ago or so. And lobe fin fishes are very common, but really there's hardly any of them around anymore. The only one I can think of off the top of my head are coelacanths, are the only lobe fin fishes that are still around as far as, like I said, I can recall off the top of my head. What?
Where are they? Like, where do they live?
So coelacanths, you find them in the Indian Ocean, is as far as I know the only place there, and they're really interesting because coelacanths are a species that was assumed to be extinct for hundreds of years. Like, it was a species that was discovered, was presumed to have, gone extinct with all the rest of the lobe fin fishes 150 million years ago or whatever. But then all of a sudden there was some marine biologist who was in, I want to say it was like Madagascar, and was just like down at the docks in some town there, and lo and behold, there's a live coelacanth in one of these guys' nets, and they were like, oh yeah, we catch them every once in a while. And like, it wasn't something that was unknown to these people that lived in this area, is that, yeah, you sometimes catch coelacanth. It's not like a thing we catch often, but it's not unheard of by any means. And since then, this is back in the 1920s probably, and since then they've been relatively well documented, sort of across a pretty large area in the Indian Ocean, actually. Again, Pokemon fans, Relacanth is a coelacanth. Or, I know you can catch them in Animal Crossing, too. There's coelacanths in that game. And really, the lobe fin fishes are the ones that land-dwelling vertebrates are descended from. The lobes eventually become limbs, basically, so they have a little bit more bony structure, a little bit more musculature in their fins than what the ray fin fishes have, and those eventually develop into full-on limbs and become the tetrapods, which is all the vertebrates besides fish, basically. And the rest of them went extinct. Meanwhile, the ray fin fishes go on to represent 95% of the species of fish in the world now. Don't quote me on that exact statistic, but the vast majority of the fish are ray fin fishes now, which is things like bass and northerns and barracudas and marlins. They're all part of this big group. Meanwhile, the placoderms, like I said, represent a group that fully died off for 300-some million years ago. So, there you go. A history of fishes.
Confusing, I am aware, but phylogenetics is hard, and regardless of where they came from, the thick body armor of these fish didn't make it through to the other side of the Devonian. The late Devonian is characterized by one of the Earth's big five mass extinctions, with a loss of 50 to 60% of the species in general, including all of the awesome fish. It's not really clear what caused the Devonian extinction or the Devonian bursts. The end of the Devonian shows signs of a rapid swing from greenhouse to a sudden glaciation, and then back again, a seesawing of climate that could be responsible for many of the extinctions. The scientists aren't yet sure why this climate change occurred, or whether the cause was actually something else. Whatever the cause, armor was no protection against the effects of it, so the armored fish disappeared. In their wake, bony fish and cartilaginous fish like sharks and rays took over the oceans, and the medieval age of fish came to a close. Thanks for joining me today, and thanks to all of our patrons who make these videos possible. And we want to thank our first two eontologists, Duncan Miller and David Rasmussen. Thank you so much for your support. If you would like to join them, head on over to patreon.com/eons and pledge for some neat and nerdy rewards. And if you're interested, like I am, in learning more about how our planet works, then go over to one of our newest sister channels, Hot Mess, which explores climate science, the effects of...
Drink it out and I'll bring it down to you. I don't think we have a sweetener. Do you want a sweetener? Oh, come on.
Let's see. Let's try this one. I don't know if we've ever watched one from this channel before, but Nature's Compendium.
The Devonian period, a time when the first forests emerged and the earliest vertebrates colonized land. While life on land was still in its infancy, life in the seas was diverse and booming. The Devonian period is sometimes called the Age of Fishes because of the diverse, abundant, and in some cases, bizarre types of creatures that swam in Devonian oceans.
I always like the age of whatever designations they give to stuff. It's sort of an informal name that happens with lots of. You get Devonian as the age of fishes, or the Mesozoic as the age of reptiles. I don't know. I appreciate it. It helps me remember when all this stuff is happening.
Among these bizarre beasts were a group of diverse and sometimes frightening fish called Placoderms. The most notorious of these armored fish was none other than the Dunkleosteus. In this video, we will focus on the largest and most well-known species, Dunkleosteus terrelli, and we will learn more about how it lived, as well as what animals they shared the Devonian seas with. Enjoy! Fossils of Dunkleosteus terrelli were first discovered by amateur paleontologist J. Terrell and his son in 1867. They were found along the Lake Erie cliffs at the town of Sheffield Lake, Ohio. He called this animal
Midwest
terrible
zone.
fish. This animal was rediscovered by paleontologist David Dunkel and was named Dunkleosteus in 1956 in his honor. The type species was named D. terrelli in honor of the original discoverer, J. Terrell.
They don't really let you do that
lived
anymore.
from
You
the
can't name
Silurian
species
to
after
the end of
yourself.
the Devonian period, from about 430 to
They let you
358
name them after
million
other
years
people,
ago.
but they won't let you name them after
The
yourself.
Placoderms were among the first jawed fish, and their lower jaws are believed to have evolved from their first gill arches. Placoderms are thought to be paraphyletic, made of several distinct outgroups or sister taxa to all living jawed vertebrates, which originated among their ranks. This means that placoderms are likely the ancestors of all tetrapods, from sharks to dinosaurs.
See, this is different, though, than what they were saying in the last one, where in the PBS video they were saying that Dunkleosteus and the placoderms were likely a group that just fully went extinct and were, maybe ancestral to other bony fishes. But this one is speaking in a pretty confident tone, saying, yeah, these guys are probably the ancestors to everything that has a jaw, basically. Which, I don't know, a little discrepancy there in our two videos. I didn't check the dates on either of these. Maybe there's new science out there that's come out between these, but...
And even keep on. This is illustrated by a Chinese placoderm, Entelognathus, which dates to 419 million years. Entelognathus is the only known placoderm with a bony jaw similar to modern bony fishes, and is the earliest example of dermal marginal jaw bones we see in modern-day tetrapods. Placoderms were also the first fish to develop pelvic fins, the precursor to hind limbs of tetrapods. They were also the first to possess true teeth, which evolved from
These are the
scales.
pelvic fins.
Dunkleosteus terrelli lived around 360 million years ago during the late Devonian. It belongs to an order of placoderms known as the Arthrodires, and was the largest and deadliest member of these animals. This species grew up to 8.9 meters, or 28.8 feet, and weighed an estimated 4 tons, or 4.4 short tons.
Bigger than a great white
Instead
shark.
of teeth, Dunkleosteus had a set of bony plates that sliced past each other in the jaws. The animal's bite incorporated connections between the skull, the thoracic shield, the lower jaw, and the jaw muscles, joined together by movable joints. This resulted in both a high speed of jaw opening and an incredibly powerful bite. D. terrelli could open their jaws in 20 milliseconds and complete the whole process in 50 to 60 milliseconds. The animal's bite could exert a force of 6,000 to 7,400 newtons when its blades closed down on its prey. Such a powerful bite suggests that Dunkleosteus had no trouble eating shelled or armored animals, such as Ammonites and other
There we go. There's
placoderms.
Ammonites.
Fossil evidence shows that these animals would have also put their powerful bite to good use against other members of the same species. Bite marks have been found on fossilized armored plates, showing evidence of repeated bites to crack the victim's armor. These bites were often found near the joints and gaps of the armor towards the back of the skull, further indicating that they were targeted attacks. Dunkleosteus and other placoderms are believed to have given birth to live young. This is evidenced by the Australian genus Materpisces. A remarkably well-preserved fossil of this animal was discovered with an unborn embryo and even an umbilical cord still present. Dunkleosteus torelli may have also given birth in nurseries similar to modern-day sharks. Devonian nursery sites like Strad in Belgium and Waterloo Farm in South Africa show that several placoderm families would gather in shallow estuaries and even freshwater systems to breed. This way, the young could grow up safe from predators and other adult Dunkleosteus. Dunkleosteus torelli are primarily found in the upper Cleveland member of the Ohio Shale, roughly 360 million years ago, during the upper Flaminian stage of the late Devonian. The site represents a shallow water community, and Dunkleosteus itself is known to have lived with other huge and varied arthrodires. Take Bulgaridus, for example. Bulgaridus was a smaller, cleaver-headed placoderm with a unique hunting style. Its curved dental region suggests that these animals would use their jaws to chop their prey up like an axe. Titanichthes was a large placoderm that was almost the same size as a Dunkleosteus. However, while Dunkleosteus was a macropredator, Titanichthes was actually a suspension feeder, similar to modern-day whale sharks. Titanichthes is one of the earliest vertebrates to show evidence of filter feeding, and only adds to the interesting diversity of placoderms. Of course, placoderms weren't the only fish around. Sharks, like Coelacanths, were already reaching 2 meters in length and made efficient, fast-moving hunters. Coelacanths is one of the best-known early sharks, thanks to well-preserved fossils. In addition to the skeleton, the fossils were so well preserved that they included traces of skin, muscle fibers, and internal organs, such as the kidneys. Even the last meals of these sharks have been preserved, showing a diet of small, bony fish, arthropods.
Yeah, it's very, very uncommon to have that type of stuff get preserved. Like, the stuff that gets preserved in the fossil record usually is stuff that's big and hard. And so you see, big, heavy bone type of stuff get preserved, but even, not only just like the soft parts of animals don't get preserved, but small animals typically don't get preserved either. It's very likely that, when you're picturing, the prehistoric world, you're probably picturing a lot more big animals than what there probably actually was, just because that's what survives in the fossil record. Because, how likely is it that a mosquito is going to get fossilized? It doesn't happen unless it gets, caught in amber or whatever. Whereas, these big, heavy, long bones from sauropods, other big dinosaurs are more likely to survive. Obviously, older stuff is less likely to survive too. So when we're talking about, stuff 300 plus million years ago and they're finding kidneys, like, that's crazy. Like, that's very uncommon.
And protovertebrates. However, it would still be a while before sharks became the dominant predators of the seas. The oceans belonged to the placoderms until the end of the Devonian. Unfortunately, the reign of Dunkleosteus and all the other placoderms came to an end during the late Devonian mass extinction. Several hypotheses have been proposed for the extinction event, including volcanic activity, volatile plate tectonics, global oxygen shortages, climate change, and even asteroids. Another interesting possibility is the Devonian plant hypothesis. The hypothesis states that it was the arrival and widespread progression of terrestrial plants that triggered the mass extinction events. The spread of Archaeopteris forests would have led to faster soil development, which would in turn lead to faster silicate weathering. This process creates calcium and magnesium carbonates, which in turn remove CO2 from the atmosphere. These compounds would then make their way into rivers and then the seas, where they would become buried in marine sediments, further lowering CO2 levels. The loss of this greenhouse gas would have then contributed to widespread global cooling, causing drastic climate fluctuations. In an ironic twist of fate, the expansion of life on land may have caused havoc on the oceans, from which life first arose.
And plant life ends up being sort of the thing that causes a lot of mass extinction events. The most like widespread, like the time in history that life has come the closest to like full on getting wiped out probably was caused by plants becoming a thing, basically. Because there was life before plants. There's a decent amount of life before plants. But when plants became a thing, they were, like, their big innovation was they used CO2 and released oxygen. And so there used to be a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere than what we have now, and a lot less oxygen. And so a lot of the stuff that existed back then didn't use oxygen the way that pretty much everything does now. Is all called anaerobic life, didn't use oxygen. Anaerobic. They used methane instead, and there was a lot more methane in the atmosphere and CO2. So the Earth was a lot hotter, and the composition of the atmosphere was a lot different. But then all of a sudden you get the first plants, your blue-green algae is becoming a thing, and all of a sudden they start taking in all this CO2 from the atmosphere and converting it into oxygen and releasing oxygen as a waste product. Obviously oxygen is a way less effective greenhouse gas than CO2 is. So you get this big change in composition of the atmosphere that, one, is going to, if you're an anaerobic thing, getting exposed to oxygen kills you. Like, there's a reason there's not much left anymore that's anaerobic, and it's because there's oxygen in the atmosphere, and it will just full-on kill that stuff. But also, the world suddenly gets really, really cold because, instead of the lack of greenhouse gases. And so, this is often referred to as the Oxygen Holocaust, you'll hear it referred to as, and it's something like 90+% of species on Earth went extinct within like 100,000 years. And like I said, it's because of how successful plants were when they first became a thing. Like I said, pretty much turned Earth into an ice ball for like 500 million plus years. And like I said, simultaneously wiped out almost all life that existed at the time. And like I said, you still do see, very occasionally, you'll see like some sort of single cell anaerobic stuff. Humans are actually one of the hosts for some anaerobic stuff. We have some anaerobic bacteria that exists in our guts. And they're among the last of their kind. As far as stuff that lives like outside of other species, it's all down by like ocean vents, or where you have your anaerobic like methane fueled things.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and sharing the video. Be sure to post in the comments below which animal featured in this video is your favorite. And if you'd like to stay up to date on all our latest projects, you can do so by following our social media or joining our Discord. You can also support the channel on Patreon and get
Nothing under the sea was safe
This
during
like
the
12 days
Devonian
old.
period with this massive armored predator swimming around. This ferocious fish had powerful jaws that could easily turn prey into chum, even its own kind. This fish almost gave the megalodon a run for its money. This is Dunkleosteus.
Yeah, right.
Hi, I'm Taliloe Mary, and you're watching Paleologic. Dunkleosteus torelli lived in the Devonian Sea, a large and shallow inland sea that covered much of today's eastern North America.
Being able to create videos about prehistoric creatures is a dream come true, and it all started as a passion project. Today's sponsor, Squarespace, will help you create your own passion project and turn your dreams into a reality.
Not our sponsor.
Squarespace is the all-in-one platform for building your brand and growing your business online. Stand out with a beautiful website, engage with your audience, and sell anything. Your products, content you create, and even your time. Knowing your audience is super important, and with Squarespace's in-depth website analytics tool, you can gain valuable information about who's visiting your website and how they interact with your content. Squarespace also connects your social profiles to your website. You can automatically post your website content to social media channels, so all your hard work is on display. And if you need the support from your audience, Squarespace even has an option to collect donations.
So, we have some kind of fossily stuff out right now, and we're doing a little bit of painting with some critters. We have a painting event coming up, so we were doing some stuff. So heads up, you're on live stream right now. But I told him ahead of time that I'd be hopping out to talk about fossil stuff. So let me wash my hands here quick. Those ones aren't. But, you know, that's kind of an interesting question. That's something that we were talking about a little bit over here just a little bit ago, was when we say if something's real, what do we actually mean? And so, one of the things that I really like to talk about is this type of stuff, where how do fossils get made, how do replicas and stuff like this get made? So you can look at something like this table that we have here, and these are all remnants of real animals that really existed at one point. We were actually just talking about the Ammonites a little bit ago because that fish I was painting there liked to eat a lot of Ammonites. And so this is a set of fossils that is potentially 400 to 500 million years old. I don't know exactly this exact date, but that's when these species are existing. And what's really interesting with these is when we think of fossils, what we think of is we picture it as sort of being like the remains of that animal. Like we think of it as being
animals.
Yeah. But what's kind of cool is like really there's no part of the ammonite that's left here. You know, what we have here is basically just a rock that's shaped like an ammonite shape. Because the way fossils get made is usually these are very polished up to be nice and shiny. So this is all stuff that lived under the water. So ammonites, and then these guys. Yeah. Yep. And so the way they work is there was an animal that was pretty soft bodied.
Ooh, painting! Yeah, we got a dinosaur night coming up. Yeah.